When I was younger, my mother and I were living in Maine. We left my father at that time for personal domestic abuse type reasons. My mother left in the middle of the night, hitchhiked to a bus stop where she finally got us on a bus. In 24 hours, we ended up in Connecticut. Now, I can't even imagine getting on a bus with a 2.5-year-old for 24 hours, but she did that. Ended up my grandmother's doorstep. We had to flee from there once again for other issues, and we became homeless. So we actually lived inside my mother's green Oldsmobile car. I remember certain aspects of it. I was very young at the time, probably around 4, 5, 6 years old, that time frame. And I remember what the rain sounded like on the hood of the car at night. I remember my mother crying when she thought I was asleep, and having to turn the car on every so often so that we wouldn't get cold during the winter months. I also remember what it was like when people found out that we were homeless and we had been living in our car for quite some time at that point. The one thing is my mother went to work every single day and I went to school every single day, and we never told anybody. And it wasn't until the graduate program that I felt brave enough to tell this story. I had held it inside me my whole life out of shame, and I thought it made me somewhat less than who I really was. By telling that story, I actually found strength in my story, and I began to really explore that story. And it didn't just end with the homelessness. There were issues that occurred for the rest of my life from that time period. A lot of that ended up being why I ended up dropping out of high school. So not only was I homeless as a youth, I was also a high school dropout and pretty much headed down a not so good, narrow path that was leading to continued poverty and angst. So my mother enrolled at Bay Path in their one-day program, and she advised that I check it out. She thought that I would make a connection with it. So I did. And I remember stepping onto campus that first time and walking into the beautiful buildings and feeling like I wasn't quote unquote worthy enough. But I pushed myself. I had something to prove to myself. I had to prove that I could do this. So I enrolled. And it was in the first couple classes there that I started to make connections with other women. And I started to hear their stories and how their stories were able to empower me and others. And I started to realize that all of us have stories or something in our backgrounds that can either prohibit us or push us forward. And I knew I wanted to share my story, but I just wasn't ready yet. But I let those women's stories help empower me and push me forward. By the time I got to grad program, that was when I was like, okay, this is it. I'm gonna do this. And I remember standing up in front of my peers and starting to read my story and crying and looking around the room and seeing everyone else in the room crying. My professor, who was so hard personality, he had tears in his eyes. And I remember at that moment thinking, oh, I got him. Being so proud, like he felt it, he gets it, and everyone in this room understands what this means. And it took a while for me to be able to tell my story without the emotion and the fear of how people were going to judge me. But it was in that moment when those women and my professor, and there was men in the class, it was a mixed program, and they supported me and they hugged me and they cried with me and they helped me understand that it was nothing to be ashamed of, but that my story was powerful. And if I used that, I could go anywhere. And so I tell this story to my current students now, and I watch the reactions on their face. And I can see the ones who they get it and they connect with it. I can see the other ones who have fears in their eyes because they're afraid to tell their own stories. And I never force anybody, but I open up the door for others to share their stories. And through each other in that room, we support each other and we help everyone understand, what is the piece that you feel is holding you back? What part of your story do you feel still holds you down? And we confront it. And by confronting it, they own it. And once you own it, you can use it to continue to propel yourselves forward. And that to me is the power of a story. And if it wasn't for education, for me walking onto campus and enrolling in college, I never would have found the power that I had within myself. It was one of the most amazing things I've ever done. And through that, I've learned that my story is not only my story, but it's everybody's story.